My sister and Mia are going to live here starting today." "What do you mean?" "I didn't hear about this." "Is there a problem with the two of them living here?" "If your mom isn't living here yet, there's room available, isn't there?" When I told Robert about my mom's plan to buy an apartment, something felt off inside me. Having Sandra and Mia live here was unexpected, and sharing the same space with them was a burden for me. I felt like I was only there to silently take care of household duties, as if it were a given. "If you don't listen to Robert properly, he'll throw you out." Sandra threatened me, but I stood my ground. I don't mind being thrown out. Besides, I'm already separated from Robert. What? I had already submitted the divorce papers when Robert was drunk. The apartment is in my mother's name. Robert and Sandra were desperate to convince me to let them stay in the apartment. However, the decision my mother and I came to was, I am Hillary Manning, aged 50. I have devoted myself to homemaking and childcare, supporting the growth of my children as a housewife all these years. I got married right after graduating from college. Blessed with 2 children, I enjoyed the busy yet fun days. Both of my children are now adults and living independently. My husband is also 50 and works at a well-known major company. He has always appreciated my role in the household, saying, "I'll leave the home to you." My husband is a bit prideful, occasionally speaking to me condescendingly. Though his attitude can be grating, the sense of security from having a reliable husband outweighed these moments. My father ran a hospital, and my mother worked as the head nurse there. Though my parents both worked and didn't spend much time together with me, I loved them dearly. My father passed away in his mid-60s due to illness. My mother deeply regretted my father's early death. If only I had paid more attention to his health and insisted he take breaks. If I hadn't let him overwork, he might have lived longer. Perhaps because of my father's death, my mother often told me that it was my job to look after the family's well-being. When I considered taking up a part-time job after my children grew up, my mother said, "I'll support you financially, so don't worry about it." Robert shared the same view as my mother, so I never worked outside the home. Instead, I focused on maintaining our family's well-being while managing household chores and childcare. My mother, being a head nurse, earned more than her peers and led a frugal life, despising wasteful spending. As I grew older, I found myself becoming more like my mother in being thrifty. Now that I am a mother, my husband's salary is sufficient for our needs. With them busy working, I often ended up cooking dinner, which naturally improved my culinary skills. My cooking was well received by the family. Because of this, we rarely ate out, which was a great help to our household budget. We lived peaceful days with my family. However, as the years passed, I began to notice a gradual change in Robert's attitude. When Sandra, Robert's sister, who is 2 years older than us, moved nearby, I felt his behavior changed significantly. Currently supporting herself through part-time jobs, Sandra had just moved in with her 20-year-old daughter Mia after a recent divorce. Sandra had left home due to her parents' disapproval of her marriage, making it difficult for her to return easily. Amidst this, Sandra often sought Robert's advice. Robert, concerned for his only sister, was very attentive to her. At that time, I was also concerned about Sandra and Mia and how they would manage their lives. When Mia's parents got divorced, she quit university. Without looking for a job, Mia flitted from one part-time job to another. When we heard the two were moving, we willingly helped out and even partially funded their moving expenses. From that time, a rift began to grow between Robert and me. I had my doubts about supporting Sandra, but Robert seemed completely unaware of my feelings. Lately, he always talked about Sandra, clearly very worried about her and Mia's life. I have to support my struggling sister. I began to hear such words from Robert quite often. Robert's visits to Sandra's home increased, and he often stayed late drinking with her. Feeling neglected as Robert prioritized Sandra, I felt lonely. As usual, when Robert returned from drinking at Sandra's home, I teased him by showing him the divorce papers. "Did you go drinking at Sandra's house again? Why don't you just divorce me and live there? Maybe you're right. Should I just sign this?" Drunk, Robert wasn't thinking straight and began to sign his name on the divorce papers. Despite being drunk, I was left speechless with surprise and confusion. In the morning, Robert acted as if nothing had happened, going about his usual routine. However, I was harboring a great deal of anxiety. The thought that he might continue to prioritize Sandra's life over mine, possibly leading to irreversible consequences, grew stronger each day. So, I decided to have a serious talk with Robert. I told him that I understood his desire to help Sandra and that I wasn't trying to negate that feeling, but I wanted him to also cherish me. I carefully chose my words, hoping we could reevaluate our relationship. "I understand that your sister is going through a tough time, but do you really need to go this far? I wish you'd care about me as much as you do about her." "Why do I have to hear this?" Robert's expression darkened. "Isn't it too much for her to rely on you just because she's divorced? Have you forgotten that I exist?" My words struck a nerve, and Robert suddenly became furious, slamming the table. Then his face turned bright red, and he began to shout angrily, "How would a housewife like you understand my sister's struggles? How can you even say that?" With that, he stormed out of the house. I wondered if I had gone too far, but I was furious that Robert could dismiss me like this. I had always put my family first, and his words felt like a denial of all I had done, tightening around my heart. The frustration and sadness overwhelmed me, and before I knew it, tears were flowing. Having devoted my days to homemaking, I felt utterly lost about why I had been trying so hard. Robert's attitude, constantly taking Sandra's side without understanding my feelings, was deeply disappointing. I assumed he was probably heading to Sandra's place even now. I was at a loss about how to deal with Robert going forward, or how we should proceed as a couple. Standing there, overwhelmed by my emotions, I could do nothing. The next morning, I calmed myself down and decided to have a proper discussion with Robert, so I headed to Sandra's house. Upon arriving, I pressed the intercom. Waiting nervously, it was Mia who came out, not Sandra. "Aunt Hillary, what's up?" Thinking Sandra might be at work, I asked Mia about Robert. "Robert hasn't come back, didn't he come here?" "Uncle Robert?" "I don't remember much from last night because I drank too much." "Is this his shoe?" Mia pointed to a shoe that was unmistakably Robert's among several scattered around the entrance. From the state of the entrance alone, I could tell the house was quite messy. After waiting a while, Sandra came out from the back. "Hillary? What are you doing here at this hour?" "Sandra, I thought you were here. Robert hasn't come home, so I wondered if he might be here." Sandra, who had just woken up, sleepily glanced at the clock. "It's this late already? I didn't realize. I'll call Robert, just wait a moment." Contrary to Robert's words of concern for his sister, Sandra's casual demeanor was somewhat deflating. Urged by Sandra, Robert appeared and immediately became angry upon seeing me. "Why are you here?" "Why not? You didn't contact me, and I was worried. Have you been drinking too much? Both of you smell like alcohol, and look how messy this place is." Seeing their state, my anger surged. Wondering what he had been so worried about, Sandra responded to my words with a retort. "Hillary, you have no right to say that to us." "That's right. What happens here isn't your business, Auntie." Mia also argued back in the same vein. "How can you say it's none of my business? Robert has been coming here every day, getting drunk." No one took my words seriously. Robert, exasperated, coldly said to me, "What's wrong with me drinking here? Sandra and Mia are my family too, and there's nothing wrong with looking after them." No one was willing to listen seriously to me, and they treated me as if I were in the wrong. I had come here hoping to have a calm discussion, but in this situation, I felt that saying anything more was futile. "It's a waste of time to talk any further." "Excuse me." When I actually visited Sandra's house, it didn't look like she was struggling as much as Robert had said. In fact, it seemed she was living a more comfortable life than before. I couldn't help but feel a dissonance seeing the two of them. With complex emotions in my heart, I headed to my parents' house. Upon arriving, my mother warmly welcomed me. Trying not to surprise her with a sudden visit, I had contacted her on the way, but she was still slightly startled by my rare visit. Nevertheless, the moment I saw my mother's kind smile, tears welled up in my eyes again. My mother noticed my distressed appearance and asked with concern, "Did you have a fight with Robert? You look like you're about to cry." Unable to hold back, I spilled out all the frustrations that had built up in my heart. After listening quietly to my story, my mother suggested that putting some distance between myself and Sandra might be one approach. "I've kept it a secret, but I've been thinking about buying an apartment with the money I've saved up. You could live there." "Really? I had no idea. Where are you looking?" "There's a luxury residential area a bit away from here, and I'm really interested in an apartment there. It would be away from Sandra's place, which might be a good environment for putting some distance between us." "Is that so? I'd like to see that apartment myself." Pleased by my mother's unexpected suggestion, I immediately sent an email to Robert. I was still upset from our previous argument, so I was a bit scared to call him. Robert seemed surprised by the message about possibly living in a luxury apartment and called me right away. "What do you mean we could live in a luxury apartment? My mother is thinking about buying an apartment. She might live with us in the future. What do you think? She's also willing to help with the costs. If it's not right away, I think that's fine." While we were talking on the phone, my mother spoke up from behind me. "Don't worry about me, you two should live there." Robert, hearing my mother's voice, seemed pleased, even over the phone. I felt a bit uncomfortable with his reaction. Later, the purchase of the apartment went smoothly, and we moved without any issues. Soon after, the discomfort I felt became a reality in front of me. While organizing the boxes that arrived at the apartment, I noticed some items that I definitely hadn't sent. Confused by the unexpected situation, I nervously asked Robert, "This isn't something I sent. Do you know anything about it?" Right as I asked, the intercom rang. Looking at the monitor, I saw Sandra and Mia. "We're here. Robert told us to come." "Why are Sandra and Mia here?" I was frozen in place, not understanding what was happening. As I stood there, Robert opened the door, and they entered. "This place is great. The view is amazing. Robert, it's incredible you bought an apartment in such a prime location." They said this while looking excited and having fun. Seeing this, my confusion only deepened. "Robert, can you explain what's going on?" When I asked with a puzzled look, Robert answered nonchalantly, "My sister and Mia are going to live here starting today." "What do you mean? I haven't heard anything about this. Is there a problem with them living here? If your mother isn't here yet, there are spare rooms, aren't there? Hillary, were you planning to live here with your mother? It's insensitive to move in as a daughter-in-law. Sandra, haven't you heard? This apartment is..." Just as I was about to explain to Sandra, Robert interrupted. "Can't we talk about this stuffy stuff later? What is Robert thinking? What did he tell them to make them think they could live together like this? They probably think Robert bought the apartment, not knowing my mother did." I felt a surge of anger at Robert's reckless behavior. However, I reminded myself to stay calm. "I'll be staying at my parents' house for a while, so please make yourselves at home." With that, I left the house. Feeling unsettled, I went back to my parents' house and told my mother everything. My mother and I decided to make Robert and the others see the consequences of their actions. A few days later, I visited the apartment to check on things. I saw Sandra and Mia acting as if they owned the place. The apartment was a mess. It seemed no one had cleaned it since I left. "Hillary, welcome back. The house is a mess because you weren't here. If you don't clean, this is what happens." Why haven't you cleaned? Cleaning is your job, Hillary. It would be wrong for us to take that away from you. Sandra said mockingly as Robert came in. How long will you keep running back to your parents? What are you thinking, leaving the house like this? There's a backlog of chores, so get them done. Sandra nodded as if agreeing with him. If you don't listen to Robert, he'll throw you out. Sandra threatened me, but I stood my ground. I don't mind being thrown out. Besides, I'm already separated from Robert. What? Robert and Sandra looked at each other in surprise. What are you talking about, Hillary? What do you mean you're separated from me? I haven't been consulted about your sister and her daughter moving in here. So I decided to go ahead with the divorce without consulting you. A divorce isn't something you can just decide on your own. Robert seemed to have no recollection of drunkenly signing the divorce papers. However, Robert's name was clearly written on the divorce form. I added my own name, submitted the form, and the divorce was finalized. When I discussed it with my mother at her house, she supported the decision to divorce Robert. She too was fed up with Robert's behavior and understood that staying together would only bring more suffering. When I explained to Robert the circumstances under which the divorce papers were filed, his expression changed drastically. Did we really get divorced? What are we going to do now? What do you mean? What are we going to do? This apartment was bought by my mother, so you will need to leave. What are you talking about? Sandra and Mia's expressions also changed as they listened. Leave? Wasn't this apartment bought by Robert? Is it true that Hillary's mom bought it? Didn't Uncle say he bought it with his money? Faced with their barrage of questions, Robert looked down, unable to respond. He must have lied about buying it himself to save face. He hadn't anticipated that being confronted with a divorce would mean he'd have to leave. Indeed, Robert worked at a major company, but not everyone there is on the elite track. I knew from a friend, who happens to be the wife of one of Robert's colleagues, that he was not on the elite track. In fact, Robert's salary was one of the lowest among his peers. I had managed his salary well and saved up enough, enabling us to live comfortably even without me working. Unaware of these facts, Sandra and Mia looked dissatisfied. Regardless, I continued, that's how it is, so please pack your belongings and leave by the end of the week. Can you give us a bit more time? It's hard to find a house in just 1 week, and we really should discuss the divorce properly. Robert was begging desperately, a pitiful sight. A week might be too short, especially since it might be hard for your sister to rely on her family. I said it almost spitefully, as if to get back at them for everything. To give them time, I decided to stay at my parents' house for a while. After a week, I visited them again to discuss further. To avoid any deadlock in the conversation, I asked my mother to be there too. My mother wasn't particularly upset about Robert attempting to live in the apartment with Sandra and Mia. However, she was furious that he hadn't consulted me, despite the apartment being in her name, and was enraged by his selfish actions. Seeing my mother's anger, Robert kept apologizing profusely. The house was much cleaner than when I had visited previously. It's been a while, Mother. I'm not sure if you'll like it, but please have some tea and snacks. Robert had even prepared coffee and sweets in an effort to appease my mother. It was clear he had told Sandra and Mia to behave respectfully toward my mother. Such actions couldn't excuse how they had treated me before. Despite Robert's superficially polite behavior, my mother started the conversation with a smile, but then spoke her mind. You're being asked to leave this house, and such offerings are too little too late. I didn't mean to divorce Hillary for real. It was just a talk when I was a bit drunk. I'd like to continue living here. Did he really think we could start over? Was he just afraid of losing the apartment? My mother retorted. You intend to continue living here together? I know how you've belittled Hillary for all she's done for the family, managing the household and childcare. Hearing my mother's words, Robert glared at me. Are you tattling to your parents like a child about our marital arguments? I can't believe you discuss such things with your parents. That's why you're said to not understand the hardships of society, Sandra interjected. At this, my mother's face turned dark with anger and she shouted, "Don't you dare interrupt." Startled by my mother's intensity, Sandra momentarily stopped speaking. However, Sandra couldn't back down easily and began to argue back. "If you're telling me to be quiet, shouldn't you also keep quiet? Isn't this a matter between Robert and Hillary?" "Why do you always talk like that, Sandra?" I shot back strongly. Sandra, as an older sister, should not be criticizing others. "Do you think I don't know what kind of life you really lead, Sandra? What real life are you talking about? I heard from Robert that you were juggling several part-time jobs, but that's not true, is it? You sleep till noon and then go to the casinos, don't you?" Surprised by where I had learned this, Sandra was at a loss for words. Robert listened incredulously. "Is what Hillary saying true? Weren't you struggling with your security job because it was tough?" Sandra, looking down, replied, "I was sleeping while working late, so they let me go." I was astonished to hear for the first time why Sandra quit her job. It was shockingly irresponsible. Since then, Sandra seemed to have repeated problems such as being late for interviews and complaining about the hourly wage while looking for other part-time jobs. As a result, she ended up in her current sloppy lifestyle as she couldn't find anywhere to work. Robert listened to this with a stern face throughout. It seemed he was annoyed to have been lied to by Sandra. My mother thought enough was enough and turned towards Robert to change the subject. "Robert, everyone, whether a homemaker or someone who works outside, does something respectable. It's a big mistake to think only those who earn money face hardships." I felt like crying at my mother's words. She wasn't wrong. I had worked hard at housework and childcare, struggling but earnestly trying to protect my family. Unlike company employees who have days off, I also manage school activities for the children and relations with relatives on top of everything else. My mother continued. "Even from my perspective, Hillary has done a commendable job as a homemaker. A husband who cannot appreciate that is failing his duties." My mother's words weighed heavily on Robert. Being faced with such a valid argument, he had no room for defense. "You lack understanding of a homemaker's life, and I don't see how you can comprehend Hillary moving forward. Divorce seems to be the only option. Does this mean I can't live here anymore?" Robert's voice trembled slightly. My mother began speaking in a calmer tone. "If you want to live here, there's a condition. You need to transfer the apartment's deed to your name and take care of the mortgage. Then, there shouldn't be any problem." The three of them were surprised by such a proposal from my mother but soon smiled. "Please let us do that. I will take responsibility for the payments." "Robert, that's great. Now, you don't have to move. I've been bragging about this house to my friends, so I'm relieved we don't have to leave." The three of them were innocently happy. They didn't realize what reality awaited them, thinking they had secured the house like a trophy. Afterward, I decided to live with my mother at her house. For now, we plan to transfer the apartment's deed from my mother to Robert and discuss the property handling later. A while later, Robert called my mobile. Since that incident, I hadn't wanted any contact with him, and I could guess why he was calling. I ignored the phone. However, as he kept calling persistently, I felt I had no choice but to answer. Right from the start, Robert's shouting filled my ear. "Why aren't you answering after I called so many times? And what's with the mortgage amount? You were the one who agreed to change the deed and take over the payments? I didn't know about the $4,000 mortgage. There's no way I can pay that much." When planning my revenge against Robert together with my mother, I had anticipated Robert's desire for the luxury apartment, so I had only paid a down payment of $10,000. Since I had no intention of reconciling with Robert, I had told my mother to pay the minimum possible down payment. "Since Sandra is there, why don't the two of you split it? I can't ask my sister to do that." According to Robert, Sandra and Mia were still living off his salary without learning their lesson. They wanted to dress appropriately for their prestigious address and kept making Robert pay for their branded purchases. Despite repeatedly telling Sandra to find a stable job, she not only refused but also made excuses for not working. Being a homemaker is a real job too. Didn't Hillary's mother say that? I had to laugh at Sandra's convenient interpretation of my mother's words. That was a context meant for those married and managing households, not quite the same for divorced Sandra. Robert, as if seeking help, pleaded with me. Can you ask your mother for some financial assistance, even a little? Why should my mother help? Ask your own parents. Don't involve me or my family. Don't say things like that. Frustrated, I ended the call abruptly. All that remained was to proceed with the division of assets. With no income of his own, the property settlement would only add to Robert's financial burdens, making his future even more difficult. This was the result of Robert underestimating me. Unable to depend on anyone, Robert continued to struggle with the mortgage payments. Meanwhile, Sandra and Mia's spending habits remained unchanged, with Sandra still not working and going to casinos. When she won at casinos, she spent all her money on her favorite brands. Every time Robert asked for my mother's help, he also shared his troubles, which I had no intention of listening to. No matter how much he pleaded, I had no intention of helping Robert. Impatient, Robert had apparently told Mia to earn money by working at a nightclub if she wanted to keep living in the apartment. This led to a huge argument between him and Sandra, escalating to the point where the police were called to their home. Unable to make further mortgage payments, the three decided to give up their life in the luxury apartment. By that time, it seems the mortgage payments had been missed for 4 months. I felt a bit sorry for the pitiful trio, thinking that if they had realized their limits sooner, they could have made this decision earlier. Now, the three of them are living separately. Since I have settled the property division with Robert, I likely won't have to see or talk to him again. Nor will I have anything to do with Sandra or Mia. I felt a sense of relief and clarity in my heart. After divorcing Robert, I had resumed my studies in nutrition. I had studied to become a registered dietitian in college and had already obtained my license. Even after getting married, I continued my studies whenever I had time. Now, after the divorce, I truly appreciate the value of this qualification. I had never worked as a dietitian before, but I always made sure our daily meals were nutritious. I am now looking to work somewhere I can make use of this qualification. Fortunately, my mother still keeps in touch with a nurse who worked at my father's hospital, and I heard they were looking for a dietitian. With my mother's introduction, I started working for the first time after turning 50. Although I am sometimes bewildered by my first job, I am enjoying a fulfilling life. I also accumulated a year of practical experience and passed the national exam to become a registered dietitian. Seeing me now, my mother mentions how great it would have been if we could turn back time a little. However, I believe that everything happens for the best, so I feel that now is the perfect timing for me to work as a registered dietitian. Having experienced marriage and divorce, I feel that my life has gained depth and my personal breadth as a human being continues to expand. Monica is a disappointing child who couldn't even go to college. She is completely different from Linda. It is my mother at home who harshly criticizes me, the older daughter in our family. My father nods in agreement, and my younger sister Linda, understanding that she is being praised, shows a confident and filled smile. My sister attends a prestigious university, and I work with just a high school diploma. My parents proudly praise my sister for her efforts. Why are we so different? I am Monica, 26 years old. I work as a web designer. I was born and raised in a somewhat rural town, living with my grandparents, parents, and sister. My sister Linda is 7 years younger than me, and she was very much adored by the family. Her opinions and whims were often prioritized, which led to me being increasingly neglected. Our parents were never equal in their treatment of us. On Linda's birthday, she would receive expensive gifts, but since my birthday is close to Christmas, it was always celebrated together, and I only received one gift. Furthermore, the gifts were mostly study materials and books, which I had no interest in at the time. When Linda started playing soccer, my parents never missed a week of supporting her at practices and games. I was a member of the tennis club in middle school, but even on my last match before graduating middle school, my parents couldn't come to support me because they had to drive Linda somewhere. Living like this, I always felt a difference between me and my sister. There were days I wanted to cry, but my sister always encouraged me. Whenever our parents compared me and my sister, Linda would say, "It's not like that. Monica is good at studying and teaching, and she can do anything." And after my last match, she said, "Good job," and gave me a small bouquet of flowers she had picked in the park. It seemed that our grandparents also grieved over our parents' attitudes. They would tell my parents to change their behavior towards me and defend me. But my grandmother passed away before I graduated from high school, and soon after my grandfather also passed on. My sister continued to take my side, but it seems that my mother didn't like that. Gradually, my mother began to speak harshly to Linda as well, just like she did to me. "If you're going to always side with your sister, you might as well stand outside too." Around the time when the snow began to pile up in the dead of winter, my mother started to threaten us like this. I wanted to avoid involving my sister in such situations, so I had no choice but to tell her, "You don't have to take my side anymore." Eventually, Linda stopped defending me and, supported by our parents, she dedicated herself to sports and studies, seemingly enjoying every day. Meanwhile, influenced by the consecutive funerals of our grandparents, our parents told us, "We don't have any savings." And I had no choice but to give up on going to college. I really wanted to study design at university, but that wasn't allowed, and after graduating high school, the only option was to start working right away. However, my desire to be involved in design was strong, and I took an office job at a design company a bit far from my hometown. The company was small and created websites for women's services like hair salons and nail salons. Wanting to study design, I repeatedly asked to do more and was also allowed to serve as an assistant to the designers. Working in the office while learning from professional designers up close was tough at times, but it actually motivated me more each day. My goal to become a web designer grew stronger every day, and studying became the most important time for me. I hardly went back home anymore. Since going home meant just being looked down upon by my parents, I felt it was a hassle. I spent any spare time I found immersed in studying design. On holidays, I used online courses to steadily acquire software skills. This effort finally paid off, and I was welcomed as a member of the design team. My enthusiasm became known to the other designers in the company, and they started introducing me to useful materials and contacts. 3 years later, I was trusted with projects as a full-fledged web designer. 8 years after graduating from high school and working successfully as a web designer, I received news that my sister was going to take the university entrance exams. Surprisingly, she was aiming for the prestigious medical school in a big city. Linda had always maintained top grades due to her hard work, and her acceptance seemed almost certain. Recalling our childhood and how she had supported me, I felt a strong desire to help her in return and offered my support. A few months later, she was accepted into her first-choice medical school. I was genuinely happy for her and congratulated her warmly. "Linda, congratulations on your acceptance. You really worked hard on your exam preparations. I truly admire you." Linda, slightly embarrassed, thanked me, but then she brought up a concern. "I have a little issue. Since it's a private medical school, there seems to be a suggested donation. It's not mandatory, but Dad and Mom are worried about being looked down on as poor if they don't contribute. But just the living expenses and tuition are already costly, so I'm not sure what to do." Linda mentioned she planned to cover her living expenses with part-time jobs, but studying in medical school demands immense dedication. I could easily imagine her struggling to keep up with the vast amount of study required. Although I wanted to help with the donation, it was impossible for my father, a white-collar worker, and my mother, who only worked 2 days a week to afford such expenses. The tuition for a private medical university itself was a substantial burden on the family finances. It seemed they intended for me to cover the costs. I was surprised that they had asked Linda to request money instead of asking directly themselves. Despite my disdain for my parents' actions, I decided to support my sister and agreed to provide for the donation and other entrance fees. Thus, Linda began living alone in an apartment near the university and started her new life. Her place wasn't too far from mine, so I thought she could rely on me any time. However, perhaps because she was immersed in her college life, her responses to me were rather curt. Still, I would receive messages like, "I want to eat this," or "I need this, please buy it for me." And I would arrange these things for her, supporting her in ways she couldn't ask from our parents. We sometimes ate together, but even then, she was brusque, focusing on her smartphone rather than engaging in conversation with me. "No matter what I say," she insists. Studying is hard. I started to feel bewildered by such responses. Somehow, Linda had become cold towards me. Even today's meal felt as if I had forced her to come out. Trying to change the mood, I brought up our parents in a cheerful tone. "Mom and Dad probably only care about you though, Linda." Suddenly, Linda stared at me intently and snorted lightly. "Of course. A medical student like me and a high school graduate designer like you are incomparable. No one cares about a job that doesn't even require qualifications like yours." Her intense tone made my blood run cold. There's no need to say it like that. Just because it's a job that doesn't require qualifications. That's the truth. Being a designer is just a title, and anyone can make a site if they look it up online. It might be better if you had a qualification, but it might be tough for a high school grad like you to get one. It's not that simple. I'm studying and working every day. It's not like you to say such things without knowing. Linda glanced at me displeased and clicked her tongue. "Dad and Mom often say that I'm going to a prestigious university and have a promising future, but you didn't even go to college and are a disappointment. I'm only going out to eat with you because our parents told me to. They say, though she's disappointing, make sure Monica doesn't fall any lower. You, the future doctor, should look out for her." Our parents have always compared Linda and me since we were children. Linda is smart, kind, and dependable, while Monica is stupid, clumsy, and can't do anything. Those words that were directly hurled at me resurfaced, and I felt like I was suffocating. My head spun, and I could only bow down and endure it. Seeing me like that, Linda mistook my demeanor for crying, gave a slight smile, said, "I'm going home now," and left. Having moved out and gained the new freedom of living alone, Linda seemed like a completely different person. Surrounded by exceptional people she never met back home, she must fully believe the praises our parents heap on her every day. If our parents say every day that Linda is undeniably a prodigy and she will definitely become a top-class doctor, it's no wonder Linda believes it without a doubt. Those words included a disdainful attitude towards me, which likely led Linda to naturally adopt the same view towards me. This year-end, as usual, I returned home for the holidays. I was asked to return home with Linda, who always had a cold attitude, so we went back together. Linda had been extremely busy with her studies and practical training, and it seemed she hadn't returned home once since starting university. Perhaps because of that, my parents didn't pay any attention to me and were completely focused on Linda. When we arrived home, the table was filled with treats like steak and pizza to welcome her, and in the evening neighbors, relatives, and even Linda's local classmates gathered for a big party. Linda seemed pleased with the atmosphere and began boasting loudly. "Mom tells me to come home more often, but my university is that prestigious one. And it's the most difficult medical school, so it's obvious that studying is tough. I'm still a student, but we have many team projects, and I can't just leave them to relax at home. Everyone keeps contacting me whenever something happens, and it really troubles me." I pretended to be cooking in the kitchen and quietly slipped away. but I could hear Linda's loud boasting clearly. To the parents and relatives, it might have been fine, but to the neighbors and her classmates, Linda's boasting probably sounded unpleasant. Perhaps tired of Linda's solo performance, when I brought over some wine, a neighborly old man tried to change the conversation to me. "Aren't you working in design, Monica?" However, Linda and my parents criticized me in unison. "You can't really talk much about her. She's trying, but..." Exactly. She couldn't even go to college and is such a disappointment. She's completely different from her sister. Among the ones gathered, there were many who hadn't gone to college and were working instead. There were people with families and parents with children, but as they were enjoying the feast, everyone refrained from contradicting my mother's words. Only my parents and Linda seemed completely unaware of the situation. I felt awkward and tried to leave without saying anything. However, Linda stopped me. "You still show your face at home a lot, don't you, Monica? I'm doing well in my university studies, so I'm not embarrassed. Maybe you can be so bold, because you don't think about anything." After saying that, Linda burst out laughing loudly. Our parents also laughed back. "If you say that much, it's surely going to hurt her. That's pitiful." Hearing those words, I immediately felt anger rising. "It seems like it's better if I don't come back next year." I got it. I managed to squeeze out those words. Relatives and neighbors looked on with concern, but I put down the tray I was holding and went to get my coat and bag. Linda and the others watched me prepare to leave. I understand everyone's feelings very well. I won't come back to this house anymore. My heart was filled with anger. I felt absolutely nothing towards my sister, just as I did towards my parents. As I said this and left, the three of them waved happily. "Don't come back again." While heading to the station, I desperately suppressed the anger inside me. Returning home always made my heart heavy. When I was aspiring to be a web designer, I could distance myself from my parents by using my studies as a reason. However, as I grew older in my career, I felt it was difficult to easily sever the bond with my parents, and I found myself increasingly troubled. Linda is still a university student and young. It might be difficult for her to understand how hard it is to work in society. Still, I think our parents were trying in their own way to raise their children. Even now, Linda is praised as a genius for her academic abilities, and everyone adopts an attitude of looking down on me. Amidst the childish exchanges, I felt anger and was filled with disappointment. If one takes pride in their work, such a relationship should not continue, even with one's parents. I was appalled by Linda's terrible behavior. But this became the moment I decided to cut ties with my family. Months after making this decision, I unexpectedly received a call from Linda. Afterwards, she persistently sent messages asking me to answer the phone. I wasn't blocking her, so I reluctantly answered. "Did you properly pay my tuition?" Linda's voice, speaking slowly to me, had a hint of urgency. I responded calmly. "I paid the donation and the entrance fee before you enrolled. What about this year's tuition? The university has urgently requested that it be paid. I don't know anything about the tuition." Even over the phone, I could sense that Linda was at a loss for words. Indeed, I had drained my savings to provide her with a significant amount of money. I had paid for the entrance fee, donation, and tuition equivalent to 1 year. My savings were almost depleted, and I had planned to pay any further amounts as they came due, so the tuition for the following years remained unpaid. And then there was the incident at the end of the year. It was unbelievable that, after telling me not to come home, they would ask me to pay for tuition. I was asked for a donation, right? I paid the other amounts because I wanted to support you. Didn't Mom and Dad send you to an out-of-state private university because they could afford the tuition? Or did they send you despite not having the money? That's not it. I have many wealthy friends, so there are other expenses besides living costs. Mom and Dad somehow managed those costs. That's why they don't have money for the tuition, so they told me to contact you. In fact, there was a reason I could afford to support Linda's tuition. It was because I had advanced in my career as a designer by switching to a major design company. My achievements as a designer were recognized, and my salary significantly increased. Furthermore, as I continued to be busy with work, I spent little of my salary and bonuses, allowing my savings to grow. I had discussed my job change with my parents, so they probably counted on my financial support from the beginning to advance Linda's education. Once they realized I could support not just the donation but also the tuition, it seems the savings intended for her tuition were spent on her leisure activities. Perhaps I was negligent, but I no longer had the heart to forgive them enough to just provide financial support. Assisting with the tuition wasn't a difficult task, but I refused Linda's request. A few days later, I was contacted by my parents, who demanded payment for the tuition, but I refused again. The urgency and accusatory tone in their voices over the phone further sank my spirits. I felt as though I no longer had a place to return to. They were only interested in my money, not in me as part of the family. Being taken for granted without any consultation was something I could not accept. Linda called almost every day. If there had been a sincere apology, maybe I could have been persuaded to forgive her a bit. However, what I actually heard was, "Please pay the tuition. If you don't, I'll be expelled. Scholarships and part-time jobs aren't enough. It would be a waste if a promising student like me were expelled, right? I'll definitely pay you back once I start working. Please help me as a family." The voicemail was filled with such self-centered words. There were also absurd messages like, "If you're troubled because they told you not to come home, I can try to persuade our parents instead." I saved those messages in a different file and deleted everything from my smartphone. After that, I sent Linda a message and blocked her phone number. No one would want to be treated by someone who only talks down to others just because they are family. This is how I completely cut off communication with my family and was able to welcome a new spring. I heard from one of the relatives that Linda somehow managed to pay for her second year's tuition with scholarships and loans from relatives. However, unable to receive living expense support anymore, Linda started working part-time. But with the immense amount of studying and exams and practical training, working part-time was harder than she thought, and she ended up dropping units and had to leave university 6 months later. I had been supporting both her tuition and sending money home, but I stopped the remittances last year when I cut ties. With my financial support gone and living on the edge, my parents now had Linda, who had dropped out of college, back home. Although Linda was academically capable, there was no money at home to consider transferring to another university. Yet she did not work locally but instead became reclusive, immersing herself in video games daily and lashing out in stress. At night, I heard from a friend who lives nearby that the sounds of family arguments are always audible. My parents seem unable to say anything to the daughter they once doted on. When I met my parents by chance outside, they looked utterly exhausted, and it seems that neighbors, perhaps out of awkwardness, hardly speak to them. One day, perhaps due to stress, my father caused an incident. While on his way to work on the train, he groped a woman next to him and was caught by other passengers and taken away by the police. Fortunately, a settlement was reached and he was not charged, but this incident forced him to resign as it was already being talked about at his workplace, and he felt uncomfortable staying. My mother had to start working, but having only part-time job experience before, it was difficult for her to find a job that could provide a significant income. My parents tried to reach out to me through relatives at times. However, their messages were always self-centered and commanding. Eventually, the relatives, tired of my parents' attitudes, told me, "We'll handle things smoothly here, don't worry," and stopped relaying their messages to me. I have finally severed all ties with my family home and am now able to live a settled life. I heard that, in addition to my reclusive sister Linda, my unemployed father has developed a poor reputation, and rumors have spread in the neighborhood, leading to them being shunned even more than before. My mother, frustrated with the situation, seems to have gone somewhere. Now, I'm told that no one can get in touch with her. Left behind, my father and Linda do not work and are living a life almost akin to homelessness. Had they valued their neighbors even slightly, they might have received some warm comfort, but given their past actions, help from those around them is virtually non-existent. I am successfully building my career in the field of design. I have been selected to participate in a major project and am scheduled to be involved in work that will leave my name known. This has motivated me to finally pursue a long-held goal, taking the university entrance exams. With sufficient savings and the current project wrapping up, I plan to start studying for the exams seriously. I also have plans to study business management, as I consider going independent in the future. With this new challenge ahead, my heart is racing with anticipation.